Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. My guest this week is Sarah Rose Siskind. Sarah is a psychedelic comedian and science comedy writer. She hosts a monthly comedy show in New York City about psychedelics and other drugs called Drug Test. She was the lead comedy writer for Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson, a TV show on National Geographic, and has written comedy for an artificially intelligent robot called Sophia at Hanson Robotics. Sarah is the co-founder of Hello SciCom, a company that combines science communication and comedy to help people in science communicate their messages more effectively. Today, we talk about the intersection of psychedelics, comedy, and science. Hope you enjoy the conversation.
Just a heads up, my eyes have been hurting a lot lately, so I might be wearing sunglasses, and it's not to look cool and intimidate you. It's because I'm becoming Stevie Wonder.
Right, that's just a side effect, the intimidation. I was going to release it with video as well, if you don't mind.
Oh, really? If you're going to do the video, then I feel like I should explain the sunglasses again.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I could keep all this in. Maybe that's the easiest thing to do.
Okay.
All right, we could just dive straight into it then. So I am here with Sarah Rose Siskind. Sarah, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So maybe we can begin with a bit of your backstory of how you came to kind of work in, I guess it's this kind of intersection of psychedelics, comedy, and science communication, right?
Yeah, a strange, weird niche space. Well, I guess it started arguably only 3 years ago. I was really interested in MDMA for helping with depression, but I knew very little, which resulted in an overdose situation. And that kind of hurled me into the field of drug education faster than perhaps other people. And from somehow not dying from a poor, cocktail that I thought was MDMA that turned out to be fentanyl and PCP. Yeah, very interesting experience. Don't recommend, ultimately, heroin. Anyway, after surviving that, I came back from Burning Man, because of course this story happened at Burning Man, as all bad drug stories do. I came back with a sort of life mission, and I wanted to help people be educated in the decisions they make about drugs. And I realized that these are as potent poisons as they are medicines, and that they have that real dark and the light side, and to examine both. But I wasn't a scientist. I didn't have any professional, accreditations, no fancy letters after my name, unlike some people, James Cooke, PhD. And so I was like, well, my sort of comparative advantage here is that I'm not running for office. I'm not going to lose tenure. So I can do stupid things like, take MDMA and take an SAT, or run a marathon on LSD. And I can do this stuff as safely as I can, but in a harm reduction capacity, and make drug education entertaining, because most of our drug education we get is abstinence-based, and mine is really based more in a sense of a harm reduction school of thought.
Right. And I mean, I guess we're in a culture where, because of the war on drugs, I mean, I guess what happened to you wouldn't have happened, right, if we actually had a more rational kind of approach to these things that wasn't just based on, just avoid it.
Correct. If I had my druthers, I would not have to get drugs from people who proclaim to be a Russian shaman at a music festival. I could get them from a CVS or from a pharmacy with a personal lab coat telling me exactly what is in what, and it would even say on the bottle. So yes, it is entirely a product of a prohibitionist world. The need for drug education, we're being failed by major institutions, whether it's public or private education, criminal justice system, even like public health services. They are mostly failing us. They're actually starting to turn around, like, to be kind of frank and optimistic. Like, I've actually been really happy seeing the changes in the past couple of years, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And so that's why I host this monthly show. I host a monthly show called Drug Test. That's like a science comedy show about psychedelics and other drugs.
Right. I mean, I'm actually talking to you from Portugal at the moment, which is kind of held up as a world-class example of decriminalization, right? And here it's had amazing effects of just, like all the things you would hope from decriminalization. Have all those measures have improved massively, and that just came out of them having a really serious opioid problem. They had a kind of fascist government until the 70s, and then when that fell, tourism kind of flooded into all the beach towns, and then they just got hit by they didn't have the kind of 60s and 70s party stuff going on here, and so it all hit at once. And then the doctor behind it, I read an interview with him recently where he said, like especially in places like America, but globally, drug policy has been used to kind of persecute, specific groups. And he basically was like, we didn't really have a group here who we like politically, it wasn't really useful, like to say drugs are this evil thing. And we can use it to lock up this particular group of people. So they kind of were just left with, well, I guess we'll just have to respond to it rationally and decriminalize and, have education programs and treat it as a health problem.
So if you're in Portugal, what drugs are you currently on?
Nothing at the moment, but it's interesting. Yeah, it's not as it's interesting seeing the different models of decriminalization because it's very different. Mm-hmm. It seems in lots of different places, right? Like, in America, it often seems to be like things are technically still illegal, but they're like lowest priority enforcement, right? So it's just you're not going to get arrested. Whereas here, it's like you can be referred to a kind of panel that will like help you if you have an addiction problem. So it's treated as a medical issue. But interestingly, like so in the UK, like cannabis is illegal, obviously, but seeds aren't. But here it's the other way around. The laws didn't get around to things like cannabis seeds. So it's illegal to own cannabis seeds. That can be a criminal offense. It's criminal to grow them. But if you buy pot from like someone on the street and you own it, or once you've harvested it, it's not illegal anymore. So these weird kind of quirks like that here as well.
I love those weird little things. Like there's a similar thing. I'm going to butcher this, but it's with mescaline, and it's like Michael Pollan wrote about it in his latest book, Your Mind on Plants. But it's something like the like, oh God, what is it? It's like the seeds are legal and like the end result is legal, but there's an in-between stage that's illegal. And so there's like a quantum leap. You have to just jump in time to like make the thing work. And drug policy is just riddled with those kinds of bizarre things. Like in America, methadone is not even technically decriminalized. So, you could theoretically be criminalized and have a legal penalty for distributing methadone, which is insane. But it's so low priority, like you were saying. Like the cops are pretty much told, like, don't do anything if somebody is, trying to acquire methadone illegally because they're clearly trying to kick their habit. But yeah, there's many different models of decriminalization. And one of the things I adore about Portugal's, because so like most of the time when I'm talking, a lot of the times I'm talking to people who actually don't believe in legalization. And some of the times I'm talking to people who I'm preaching to the converted, they're psychonauts. One of the things I say to the psychonauts is that it's really important that if we're going to do mass decriminalization or legalization, frankly, we have good public health institutions set up for addiction and for homelessness and related drug misuse issues. Because right now we have a horrible system, but it doesn't mean that if we completely legalize and decriminalize everything, there's not going to be like a massive culture shock and a lot of issues. And Portugal, I was reading about in a book by Maya Sullivan, it's called Unbroken Brain. They seem to have a system where there's like almost like communal or like tribunals that will like evaluate whether you're responsibly using a substance or not. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
That's very interesting to me because one of the things that does, part of me finds that terrifying because I hate the word tribunal. It sounds very Hunger Games. And part of me loves that because it makes addiction a community issue where like now people around you kind of care and they're showing that they care and they're not penalizing you, but they are like, scrutinizing it and they may remove access, but they're not going to like penalize you the way we do in this country. Do you know like how well that system is doing?
It's, all the measures seem to be, along with kind of, needle exchanges and all these kinds of things, everything seems to be improving. And I think you're right that the way the legislation is written, it's kind of, it doesn't even really, seem like a punishment. It's like if, if there seems to be a problem, you can be referred to this kind of tribunal where a group of experts will kind of assess your situation, and then the idea is to offer you help, right? Is to say,
Right.
do you need assistance here, not to punish you, right? So I think it seems to be going very well, and hopefully this is a model that other people will imitate in future.
Absolutely. I mean, didn't Portugal help like establish a lot of explorers who came to America? Can they export more things
Right.
to America now? Like,
exactly.
600 years later or something.
Right. And so with the situation we're currently in, where after decades of fear mongering around this stuff, do you think like comedy is a particularly useful way of like educating? Because it seems to kind of short circuit people's fear response, right?
Yeah, I used to write TV for a host named Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's like a science communicator, and he had this great saying. He said, "People can't laugh and be afraid at the same time." And while there is, nervous laughter, there really is like a truth to what he's saying, because I think it's a backdoor to consciousness, and I think like I could not exist if there were real scientists in the field, like establishing the research and the seriousness of these substances and compounds as medicines. But I also realized that there was a trade-off. Like when all of these scientists and public policy experts are trying to be taken seriously by the FDA, there's like a real sanctimoniousness that people can associate with psychoactive substances. And frankly, there's also potentially an over therapizing of substances where like on some level, one, it can just be fun, and two, it's also kind of like, even if it's not fun, you should have the cognitive liberty, the freedom to do what you want with your consciousness, even when that involves risks. So there's aspects of a post-prohibitionist culture that I'm trying to establish with my show. And so I'm not the role of somebody who's going to like win the battle with the FDA. I'm not going to win the role like with local boards. What I am trying to do is set the world up to be kind of grandiose seeming, so that when these substances are legalized or decriminalized, just mass accessibility to these substances, that we have a good culture to accept them, and that like I was saying, with Portugal, we'll have a lower risk of drug overdoses, of irrational exuberance, which can lead to crushing disappointment. Like people will just be savvier about this kind of stuff. I think that we will eventually embark on a new culture where it's going to be like, all right, so these substances are legal, but now we have to have the apprenticeship of freedom. Like Alexis de Tocqueville had this whole concept of like, apprenticing freedom is like the struggle of life. Like, what are you going to do with the massive freedoms you've been given? And that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, that's a great point. That I guess when people hear about decriminalization or legalization, they might think, well, that's just going to be a free for all. It's just going to be chaos, and no one. They might have the sense that there isn't anyone actually trying to actively build a culture that would support this. And I mean, as you say, that's the real work. To me, in the past, I think I used to be guilty of seeing a bit of a dichotomy between kind of clinical use and recreational use, and more I'd see it as a continuum where, ideally recreational use, having a great time in community, that can be really healing and really kind of, if it's almost as if that's the kind of final stage of any kind of therapeutic work, is to be fully integrated into a community, living in a happy way. And psychedelics and other drugs can really assist with this. So, but of course, that requires a huge amount of kind of education and just, as you say, apprenticing freedom, knowing how to navigate this stuff so that it's not just leading to all these kinds of, the possible dangerous things that could happen.
Totally.
And I feel like you're kind of, part of this movement it seems to be growing as well, right? People like really trying to change the culture.
No, that's a really wonderful compliment. Thank you for saying that, because I really want to be doing that. That's my goal. And if I do that at the sacrifice of looking like a real idiot, that will be fine by me, because that's what I do as a comedian. You know, I'm kind of impenetrable in that sense. But I love what you're saying also about the spectrum of recreational and therapeutic, because yeah, I think like there's actually a sometimes a false dichotomy, because like I've seen people at raves in the corner like crying about their grandmothers, and like, you know, they found a space, you know, the therapy wanted to come out in a super recreational setting and it found its way. And then I've seen, you know, I once went to an ayahuasca ceremony where I was really hoping to like get in touch with my ancestors, and I ended up just like really wanting to talk about the movie Inception and just like having nobody to talk about it with, and being like, okay, overly therapeutic setting. And so there really is a continuum, and I'm kind of like, I like, I guess personally, I like experiences that are always combinations of both.
Right.
But yeah, so your original question about comedy, I find, you know, really interesting, because I think there's something fundamentally absurd that gets exposed when you take psychedelics. Is like you get exposed to a lot of absurdities of the universe, and that is like one of the core tenets of comedy itself, is like to embrace the absurd. And the absurd itself is like it's strange juxtapositions, it's the unexpected, sometimes it's the futile, but to have a positive attitude about those things. And so for me, laughing is a type of like existential triumph, because you're looking into the abyss, and instead of the abyss talking back, you're like kibitzing with it. You're
Yeah.
like laughing at it.
Yeah, I love that. I completely agree. Yeah, I feel like, I mean, especially if you take a kind of scientific worldview, the universe can seem kind of, yeah, absurd, right? Just there's no kind of grand overarching kind of purpose to it. It's all just kind of happening. And the relevant thing to me seems to be, if you feel alone, then you can feel scared and depressed and like have this nihilistic perspective. If you feel connected, which could be through psychedelics, it could be through laughing with other people, then it's this sense of kind of a joyous absurdity, right? Kind of cosmic joke of just, you know, Alan
Yeah.
Watts used to kind of write about this, of just
Mm-hmm.
life being like a kind of a dance or a play, you know, you don't, or like, like music, right? You don't just rush through to the end to the purpose of the piece. It's about the journey, right? It's just this, it's, you know, music is ultimately meaningless. It's just, but it's joyful, right? And great. So, yeah, there seems to be a similar thing here with psychedelics and comedy, like being, especially in a kind of comedy club, it is a kind of temporary altered state. It feels like where you're, I mean, people are actually physiologically going to be altered by by laughing in that way, right? And you are kind of, it feels very like with a psychedelic experience, you're getting out of your rational mind instead of this kind of linear thinking, and you're being more present. I definitely have that experience when I've gone to comedy shows of feeling like, all right, we're really here together in this room.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it seems to open up. Do you feel there's like a kind of similarity there between kind of those two things?
Absolutely. And oh boy, is this the bread and butter I love talking about. Yeah, so 100%. One of the interesting things about comedy is that, like many art forms, watching it is a creative act as well as performing it. So, like, I had a wonderful professor in undergrad, Professor Gordon Teskey, who had this theory called air guitar, which was sometimes a song is so good that you just need to like play pretend on an air guitar when you're listening to it. It's because like what's happening in your brain as you're listening to a song you just discovered, like this new work of art, is like actually kind of similar to the process of creating like that song or writing that joke. And so the observer is actually kind of like a participant, because comedy, especially, even much more so than music, does not exist in a vacuum. Like if a joke is told and no one is around to hear it, like is it really even a joke? Because you don't know if somebody was going to laugh at it. So there's a very like a participatory element to it. And so it's a very communal thing. And being in a room, like being on stage and performing comedy, is actually maybe the most altered I ever get, because time really slows down. A lot of comedians talk about this. Time really slows down. And this might be a myth, but like I really do feel like I have a subliminal or like a nervous system sense of whether people are going to anticipate the punchline, whether they didn't get it and I need to like kind of harken back to it, whether they loved it and I'm going to do a callback later. And it's on a nervous system level, and it's time slows down because there's so much stimuli, and I'm reading a room of like many different consciousnesses, 80 different consciousnesses, like all focused on mine. And I regularly faint after my shows because the come down, from that state of, accepting that many brains to just being in my own could be kind of crushing, disappointing, or exuberant, or too exuberant, depending on the night. That it's overwhelming, just like for my body. So the irony of my show about psychedelics is that like I'm extremely altered just by doing the show.
It's really interesting to me that what you're saying about the effect on the body, because for me, part of the reason I started talking about psychedelics is I found them particularly very healing, and in particular, I would kind of do kind of body work, like tremoring out kind of stress with LSD. But what I would often find is after like 8 hours of doing this very intense, feeling kind of almost like shadow work, like feeling the stressful kind of fear stuff, almost always I'd get to a point where laughter would happen, and it would require something. It could just be anything, like something mildly amusing, but then you'd get into that kind of like crying with laughter and like real kind of belly laughs. And after on about the second or third time it happened, I realized it wasn't just that thing was funny. It was like, this is, my body knows it needs to do this now. It really wants to, like, it's trying to feel grounded, and it's got a lot of the tension out of the way, but there's this like, I guess there's some tension inside, like really in the diaphragm, and the only way for it to come out is to kind of do this really deep laughter. And it's similar when people are high and they're kind of, with cannabis, and people start laughing, but often it's impossible to explain where the joke began, right? It's almost as if everyone's primed ready to laugh for this kind of physiological tension release, and it takes this kind of smallest thing to trigger it. So to me, I think it's really potentially a very healing thing as well, right? It's so embodied in that way.
Oh God, yeah. The whole physicality of the psychedelic experience is very interesting. For the classic psychedelics, for anything that's a tryptamine, like since it works on like where your serotonin would go, one of the things I found most interesting early in my research was that the majority of serotonin is found in your gut. And
right.
So like for psilocybin, for LSD, like people often report feeling like, upset stomach, or just conscious of their stomach sometimes. And then combine that with like, oftentimes I feel like for my experiences and other people's anecdotal experiences, there's a lot of like laughing that happens like deep in the belly. And so when I think of a lot of like psychedelic experiences, I think of it as like being very like warm and like emanating from your Buddha belly, like as you're laughing. And it kind of dissimilar perhaps to MDMA, which can be a little bit more of like a jittery nervous system situation, at least in my experience.
Right. I mean, you also spoke about kind of doing science communication stuff, writing, was it for Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And I mean, I feel like there's also a connection there with kind of, astrophysics and cosmic kind of, you get into these very kind of cosmic mind states with psychedelics, right? Was that a kind of an explicit link that led you to that, or was it just the passion for science communication?
It was not actually. And just sort of a side note, like doesn't perfectly answer your question, but an interesting point. There was an overlap when I was interested in psychedelics and working with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I asked him, because I had to, when you get into psychedelics, you become an evangelist. I was like, so, Neil, have you ever tried psychedelics? Like hoping beyond hope, this guy would know that everybody who watches Cosmos is high off their ass. Anyway, he is a not at all friendly towards psychedelics or any mind-altering substance besides wine. And he's been asked about it, and I actually kind of love his answer. His answer is like, in the history of humanity, we have been trying to overcome our biases and to be truly reasonable, to understand the universe empirically and with rationality. Why on earth would we want to jeopardize that and throw into the mix more ways of confounding our observational senses? Now, why I love this answer is two reasons. One is because it really shows that this guy gets high on science. Like, he really gets high on science. He loves, it's gonna sound crazy, but motherfucking Neil deGrasse Tyson loves the motherfucking stars. Like, he really, really does. And the second reason I love what he said is he has no idea how psychedelics work. Because his idea is like, you're seeing leprechauns everywhere, and it's like, he would be very surprised perhaps to know that you actually increase your sensorial perception rather than decrease it, and that your cognitive abilities are not particularly affected. Your emotional, you may not care as, like, this is why I took an SAT on MDMA, is because I was curious about, like, how impaired am I? And the truth is not that impaired. You don't care as much. You don't want to be doing this stuff as much, but you definitely can. And your cognitive functions are not that affected. Granted, that was one anecdotal time. I haven't run a study. Somebody should, but yeah, people tend to. Neil was misinterpreting how psychedelics work, but oh gosh, yeah, if only he understood just how profound the combination of an understanding of the cosmos and then a emotional, like, transformation that comes from perhaps an altered state of being could induce. It would be, I would give my left leg to be the person who gets Neil high.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was listening to a podcast called Great Moments in Weed History, and they had an episode where they're talking about how apparently Carl Sagan was a big weed smoker.
Yes,
which I didn't know. And in retrospect, you have a sense of like, oh, of course, as you say, everyone who watches the original Cosmos hosted by him is probably high. And yeah, I guess it's something he couldn't afford to be open about it, but it does make sense in retrospect.
There's also, I should add the element of, like, there's also the fact that Neil is Black, and he's from the Bronx, he's actually, I think he's like an older boomer, so he grew up in like the 50s and 60s, and so, like, he's seen communities decimated by crack epidemic and other drugs, and especially in Black communities there's a deep wariness and skepticism of drug use, especially for extraordinarily preposterously successful people like Neil, who only have a lot to lose. I mean, if Carl Sagan already is not out and out about his marijuana use, it's unlikely that Neil would be. So there's that element, which is real and important to consider in the whole Neil deGrasse Tyson hating psychedelics bit I mentioned.
Right. I mean, I think when you get into the kind of, I guess, the kind of trippy cosmic stuff, it makes me think that there's a real people seem to split as to whether they see science as aligned with these kind of psychedelic states. And to me, psychedelic experiences are entirely naturalistic. They make me kind of stand in awe of everything we know scientifically. It all fits together. To other people, they get a real sense of like pushing back against science, right? And feel it opens up kind of spiritual dimensions that are completely other to science, right? I mean, for me, I find it, I guess I've never been tempted to kind of go down that road. To me, like, being scientifically minded just means that you want kind of all your different experiences of the world to fit together in some way. You want your understanding to all kind of cohere. Is that something you value, like that kind of that scientific mindset?
Well, I think that that's a great dichotomous outcome you outlined, the way that people can either super adhere to a traditionally scientific understanding of the cosmos or allow for very supernatural forces. But I do think that there is sort of a large-scale misinterpretation about science, which is there's really like two epistemologies that are kind of within science. And the first one is empiricism, And then the other one is rationalism. And empiricism is probably the more scientific between the two epistemologies, like ways of knowing something. And what I love about empiricism is that it can be summed up in, once again, a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson in one of his books, which is my favorite quote about science and empiricism. And it's this: the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. It's like, what's great about empiricism is just observation. You have to be, to some extent, a little bit neutral and just observe what is happening. And you may not know why it's happening, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Now, here's the thing. If you took that principle and you extrapolated it, and somebody takes psychedelics and they see machine elves, they can say, I don't know why this is happening, but I fucking saw machine elves. And so machine elves are real. And here's the theory. Maybe DMT transports me to a different plane where I can see interdimensional beings. And that's why they're there. That would be like the Terence McKenna type approach. And that isn't necessarily like not empirical. Like, I guess better empiricism would be to run repeated trials. And the truth is, sometimes a lot of people see machine elves. They could be suggestible, but that does happen. So I do think like empiricism and rationalism are slightly different. And just because somebody has extremely out there views doesn't mean they're not being quote unquote empirical. I also want to say, like, off of that point, and as you can notice, I'm not answering this question personally, but I am talking in big grandiose theories. I'll get to that in a second. I also want to mention, like, these substances make you open-minded, perhaps to a fault. There's a lot of people who believe in QAnon who got there because of psychedelics. Like, the QAnon shaman does not exist in a vacuum. Like, I know about people like this who think of Trump as a fifth dimensional light mover. And also on the left-wing side of things, who, don't believe in GMOs and don't believe in vaccines and, think that, global warming is going to happen tomorrow, and you're an evil person if you fly on an airplane. Like, there's a lot of different ways that you could, when you're open-minded, like the conclusions you could come to. And some of them, like, it's sort of like a Kurt Vonnegut book where, like, sometimes what appears crazy is actually kind of rational. Like, if you're an environmentalist survivalist, like if you live in a bunker and you don't associate with anybody who drives a car or flies in a plane, that's not necessarily irrational if you're reading a lot of reports that come out of major accredited academic universities. It's just like we have different conclusions looking at the same stimuli. So, I think the question is a little bit more complicated than, like, some people becoming Looney Tunes when they take psychedelics and some people falling in love with the scientific realities of the world. For me personally, I'm just too conscious of my bias, which is like, I am an atheist, an agnostic atheist who wishes to God that God were real. Like, I would love it if there was like mysteries, spirits and shit. And so, one of these days I'm going to take a trip that's going to convince me. So I think, like, it's important to sometimes think not just about, like, what do you think, what do you suspect, what do you observe, but also, like, what do you want to be the case? And then you have to check the first category against the second category. And I'm just a irreparably biased observer.
Yeah, those are great points. I'm very aware of my bias in the opposite direction, that if there were supernatural beings, I would not feel happy about that. I quite like being left alone to just be part of the unfolding, natural laws.
That's really interesting, because I have this, like, 4-quadrant theory, which is like, you either want to believe in God or you don't want to believe in God. You either do believe in God or you don't believe in God. So you could be a person who wants to believe in God and does believe in God. You could be like a gay person in the South who does believe in God and doesn't want to believe in God because, you're fucked, you're going to hell. You could be like me, a person who doesn't believe in God but wants to believe in God, or you can be a real weirdo like you who doesn't want to believe in God and doesn't believe in God.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess we get into. I guess I don't believe in a supernatural God. I do believe like it's a useful word for like a naturalistic. Anyway, we could go down a whole a whole thing
Yeah.
there of kind of
Yeah, no,
Spinoza.
that's true. Like, what is God and
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah, that's true.
but if we say like supernatural beings, like so I mean, and I also completely agree with your first point that it's not a simple dichotomy because, I mean, to me, the reason I like science so much is I really don't think I see it the same way as the average person. I think, to me, science is all about being completely open-minded and skeptical in a wonderful way where you're not, as you say,
Open-minded and skeptical.
you're like you're basically not holding on to anything rigidly. You're just everything's about you're just trying to map what's going on, and you're not actually even saying what it is. Like I think people have this impression that scientists really know what quarks are and what subatomic
Right.
particles are, but we don't. We can't really say anything about what they really are, but we're coming up with a map.
Right.
And so that puts it in a far more humble perspective that I think more people would be on board with than the idea of
Science is a process, not a set
yeah,
of beliefs.
and it never reaches an end point. So you have to be open minded, but you also have to be skeptical to kind of to make sure you're not fooling yourself. But yes, I mean, you take DMT, like you mentioned. My first DMT experience was experientially it gave me huge pause. Like it really felt like I just like it really felt. I remember one of my first thoughts afterwards was like, well, throughout all of human history, people have believed in spirit worlds and these, disembodied entities, and I've just met them, and they seemed more real than anything I've ever met in my life. I think an honest first thought is maybe that's maybe that is all real, and the last few hundred years of science has just been us kind of intentionally putting on blinkers and saying, no, just look at this stuff we can measure and ignore all that stuff. Now, after repeated experiences, I came to just through, again, I guess like an empirical approach, it seemed to me more like dreaming or something where it seems very real, but it made more sense that it was my mind generating it. But so I guess I would put that in the camp. I think exactly as you're saying that, like, to me, that's a scientific approach. Science doesn't mean you say, well, in my high school textbooks, it says entities can't be real and that science is a finished process and we have all the answers. It says, we're going to continue mapping the world. So it could turn out DMT sends you to another dimension with entities, but
for scientific reasons, you have to keep taking DMT. Is that what you're saying?
There was a time when I probably would have told myself that. Yeah.
So a couple of things. What do you know the term noetic?
Right. Yeah.
William James's term. So like that's a wonderful term I love because it's just William James, the psychologist, had this term noetic, which is like the sensation of knowing, which is like different from when you're exposed to something and you just observe it. It's like, no, I know this to be true. And that's a really powerful sensation. And it's a real thing because, like, for example, love is noetic. Like there's no outward, you can't like do an fMRI and say, oh, you're in love. You just have to know it when you see it, like that, Potter Stewart quote about obscenity. But the, love psychedelic version. And so, noetic qualities are kind of interesting because they are themselves an epistemology. That is, and it's similar, it's faith. Faith is a noetic quality where, you can't prove it, you just know something to be true. And I think we all do take tiny leaps of faith every day. Like to say that gravity is going to work the next day. You don't know for a 100% guarantee. You can say with extreme likelihood that's probably going to happen, but it is a very, 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 very tiny leap of faith that we take. So it's not like on the other end of the spectrum is, maybe belief in the Old Testament God who thinks mixing fibers is a sin, where it's like, wow, you took a lot of leaps of faith to get there to this big theory. But I do think there's kind of a spectrum where we all, to exist in the world, we do have to take tiny leaps of faith, which involves imbibing in the noetic quality because we would be thrown into a state of too much uncertainty if we didn't. So that is, psychedelics have sort of helped me a little bit in that sense, I would say, to be secure in the uncertainty and to have maybe a little bit of faith in myself. And in my experiences. So I will say, okay, I've got one spooky story for you. I've got a spooky story. So I tried DMT once, and it was my first time. And I was brought to a forest that I knew. It was a forest that was very meaningful to me. It was where I had a backpacking trip. And like a couple days later, I was thinking about that trip, and I was like, wait a second. I was looking down on that forest, but I've only ever walked through the forest. I have never seen it from a helicopter. So I was like, well, Google Earth exists. I can look this up on Google Maps. And I did. And it looked exactly like what I saw in my DMT trip. And I had never looked this up on Google Maps before. And so, you know, that's kind of spooky. I have a theory that's a little bit more neuroscience-y about why that might happen, which is that I think DMT could possibly change your sort of like spatial orientation so that you could imagine pretty easily what you look like from the sky. And then that has also led me to believe that do you know what the Nazca lines are in South America?
Right, yeah.
That perhaps that those were countries that were ingesting ayahuasca.
Oh, that's interesting.
DMT. Yeah, and perhaps that was they were able to, in a sort of like DMT-induced state, to create giant patterns on the ground that would be extremely hard to do without an aerial perspective.
And also, I mean, I think when people see the Nazca lines, they're left with a sense of like, well, who are these for? If they didn't have planes and stuff, they must be for aliens. But if you routinely have experiences where you feel like you are kind of out of body experiences, then it makes sense why the culture might have some art form like that, I guess. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of like, so my empirical experience was like, I don't know, ghosts exist. You know, like my empirical experience was like, this is a spooky phenomenon. Rationally, that's where I try to come up with the reason behind the empirical experience. I could have gone with ghosts, or I could have gone with neuroscience. And, you know, it's like my training, you know, the milieu I've grown up with, I much more comfortably went to like, what would be an interesting neuroscientific hypothesis to explain this phenomenon. I can't prove it. I don't have access to an fMRI either way. But that's the difference between rationalism and empiricism.
Right. I think it's also the point on gnosis. It makes me think, you know, why it's really necessary to both have experiential kind of Gnostic knowledge combined with rational investigation. Because, so for me, you know, my first experience of gnosis was of this kind of like noetic quality was the kind of classical mystical experience where your kind of mind goes silent. You're, you know, almost like ego death type thing where you're fully in the present moment, and you have this utter conviction that like now, like before you were basically asleep, you're going about your life in a kind of dream state, but this is it. Like you are now fully awake, and this is more profound and more real than the way you normally live. And that feels very convincing. And then with the DMT experience, it feels almost like you're having, for me at least, it felt like having some crazy dream where the noetic quality was just cranked up to 11. And I couldn't quite say what I knew, but it was like this whole crazy Looney Tunes cartoon in 5D is ultimate reality or something. And so after that, I'm left with this feeling of, well, with the kind of mystical experience one, it fits perfectly with my understanding of neuroscience, of how the kind of self is constructed, you know, neurobiologically and psychologically, fits with, you know, other aspects of science. So that one, I think you take the rational investigation and the noetic quality, and they seem to marry up. At this point with the DMT, I can't, unless we have a real revolution in our, you know, scientific understanding of the world, I can't make it square up. So with that one, I'm more inclined to think that my brain was having its kind of like certainty signal just cranked up in some way. But again,
yeah, you go. Sorry, go ahead. I want you to finish what you're saying. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying that I at this point this is where the open-minded skepticism comes in. I really don't think we can close any doors at the moment as to what's going on there, but yeah, my instinct is it can be incorporated into our current framework.
Yeah, but isn't that just like a beautiful irony? Like essentially what you do when you take substances, you change the chemicals in your brain. And for some people, when they do that, they're like, I see the world in a fundamentally different way because I've put chemicals in my brain. And other people become super materialistic and reductive, where they're like the whole world, like super solipsistic. They're like the whole world simply exists inside your brain. And you can, by, changing chemicals in your brain, you change the way the world looks. Ipso facto, we'll never actually know how the world is because our brains are just too manipulatable. And other people are like, no. By changing tiny little, structures in your brain, adding it just a new little spice element. Now I can see things I previously didn't see before, but I know those things are true. And the old things, those are stupid. It's just like you go, the exact same experience brings people to very different conclusions.
Right. I watched, speaking of DMT, I also watched on YouTube, you have a bit of one of your drug test shows about your ayahuasca experience, which was really, really enjoyable. And a lot of it resonated as well. There was a bit about, where you felt your head was being cradled by some kind of cosmic maternal force, and then you realize you were wearing a hat, right? And it's I've definitely had that kind of experience where, again, with DMT, where you feel like you're experiencing something that's really real, and then you realize it's an interpretation of something going on around you. Those are actually the kinds of experiences that really made me come back more to feeling on solid ground with like a scientific understanding of like, this is in my head.
So this is why I feel like comedy has a really, really important role to play in the psychedelic movement. If you were to just read certain articles in the New York Times, like not Rolling Stone, but like the New York Times and like Science Magazine, about how psychedelics work, you would assume like, yes, I'm going to have a warm cosmic mother like approach me and like tell me the secrets of the universe. And in that experience, some people would say like, oh, how silly am I? I thought it was this cosmic maternal force cradling my head, but it was actually just me wearing a hat. Whereas for me, like, yes, it was funny, like the reality did not match the expectation, but that didn't make it any less important because I was the cosmic maternal force. And yes, it was as simple as putting a hat on my own head. But like, isn't that what a lot of being a mom is just like, expressing your love by taking care of somebody in a myriad of tiny ways. And so to be able to laugh and think of and be completely silly and to like, like one mistake a lot of people make, I think, in ayahuasca experiences is they think if it's modern, it's bad. So unless I'm seeing a jaguar from, like a Peruvian jungle, like I won't trust anything that happens. If it's the Pillsbury Doughboy telling me my mom loves me, I won't trust it because what a strange messenger. Whereas in reality, as we know, like strange messengers abound in the psychedelic world, and you shouldn't necessarily question, what the message you're getting just because the messenger is a bit absurd.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the insight you had really, that resonated with me as well. A lot. In an early psychedelic experience of mine, I prepared everything the night before and then got up in the morning, kind of took the substance, and then had a very similar experience because historically I'm quite kind of organized, and I tend to kind of have this instinct to take care of other people and stuff, often to my own kind of neglect. And then in this situation, I thought I might want to go out for a hike, and I'd prepared my bag with exactly what I needed. I'd left my shoes lined up. I'd left like a bottle of water. Wow. And I saw it like in this altered state where I'd just woken up and, I was in this this altered state. And then it was really moving to me. It was like past me had really done this really kind, thoughtful, like preparation. And it really hit home as this really, and it stayed with me ever since, like as a really kind of profound moment. So I felt it's very similar, right? This act of just putting on a hat or preparing a bottle of water. And it's you wouldn't normally have that instinct. Yeah.
No, that's really, really wonderful. I love that. Yeah, it's true. Because you don't usually think about it like that. But it is like, you learn we all know this on an intellectual level, you learn to parent yourself, but that doesn't mean that you learn to love yourself. And so what's great about psychedelics is you can see the love as well as the logistical conveniences.
Right. And also, you're wearing a Hello SciCom t-shirt. I'd love to talk to you a bit about that project.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually contacting you from the Hello SciCom offices.
Oh, great.
So there we are. My lovely contractors and co-founder over there.
So can you tell the audience a bit about what you do?
So I have a company that helps scientists and tech professionals be less boring. So it is a epidemic of boringness in the fields of STEM. And we try to consult with people to make their communication materials more entertaining, whether it's speeches or web copy, pitch decks. We actually have a real specialty of creating robot personalities. So either AI companies or robotics companies will oftentimes be developing voice assistants or like charismatic characters. And we have a bunch of writers who used to write for TV and other robotics companies. And we help to work with engineers to create personalities that you actually want to talk to. So we have a bizarre job that could only exist in 2021. And I'm very, very grateful. And if anybody, needs any advice being less boring, go to hellosci.com.
I think I saw online as well that was maybe one of your early projects in this kind of area for Sophia the robot, writing kind of comedy for that.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So that's how I met my business partner, and just how I got into this bizarre field. I was writing for Neil's show, Star Talk, and we interviewed Sophia the robot. And then I met the CEO, and I was like, I have a spreadsheet of robot jokes. I think robots are hilarious. And she was like, you're hired. And so I started writing for Hanson Robotics, and I learned how to code a bit. I learned engineering. I met my co-founder. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I was still working there. And there was a Sophia in New York City for a conference. And then the pandemic hit, and she couldn't be shipped back to Hong Kong. And so I had to live with Sophia the robot in my tiny New York City apartment for 6 months, like working on her every night, making sure she was well-oiled and functioning fine. And it was the most bizarre experience to go through a pandemic with a lifelike robot, right next to your bed.
This has been so much fun. Thank you. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more?
Yeah, so definitely go to our website, HelloSci, HELLO SCI.com, or follow me on Twitter, in the words of Ram Dass.
All right. I'll put those links in the description as well. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me. You're a really fantastic interviewer.
Great, thank you. Great guest as well.
Thank you.